We moved next to an Irish alcoholic on one side and then a family of sex workers on the other, a mum and her mother and a daughter. It was just an eye-opener. Day one, I've moved in. As I'm settling down to sleep, there's this police helicopter that begins to circle, and then you hear the sound of like a car being joyridden up and down the kind of narrow terrace streets, and then it gets wedged in the alleyway between the wheelie bins, and I'm just thinking, this is bonkers. Like, what am I doing here?
Welcome, everybody. This is Simon Gilbo with Inspired. Great to be back for another fantastic week, I have no doubt. If you're new to Inspired, it's all about listening to great stories from mates of mine from across all sorts of different walks of life who have journeyed with Jesus for some time, who've experienced the highs and the lows, who are doing beautiful kingdom gospel work. And we are bombarded relentlessly by negative news, by grimness and stuff that causes anxiety and makes us generally depressed. So this is to counteract that. I have no doubt that in 50 odd minutes you're going to leave with a smile on your face and feeling inspired, because we've got a fantastic guest with us. His name is Sam Ward. Welcome, Sam.
Hello, mate. Great to be with you.
Yeah, so good to be with you. I think Sam and I go back about 10 years. I've been across when I was still living in Burundi. They flew me back a few times to speak at the Message Trust, do this annual conference. What's it called again?
The Proximity Conference.
Proximity, yeah. And Sam's headed up for years Eden. He is now the Chief Executive of the Message Trust. We've had Andy Hawthorne on. We've had Linz West on. We've had different people that have been through the Message. The Message has churned out a stunning number of people. And Sam is one of those who's the fruit of that work and has had a fantastic impact. So, Sam, listen, let's just crack on in there. I don't know much about your background. Tell us a little about your upbringing.
Well, I was born in Shropshire, a rural upbringing, quite idyllic in some ways. Lovely Christian parents. Although we weren't particularly affluent, we had just a lovely kind of existence. I remember from a very early age being able to walk to school with my sister, probably age 6, without any parents. The kind of freedom to roam from an early age. As long as you were back for tea time, you could really go wherever you wanted and do whatever you wanted. So I would fish along the River Severn and go for long bike rides on country lanes and things like that. It was pretty good, I would say. I have very many sort of positive memories of my early years as a child. I suppose that shifts up a gear when age 12, my parents decided they'd move us to Manchester, which was an absolute total change for us. It was something else that I just remember being massively impacted by the culture shock. And my folks, I suppose, wanting to be able to give us a bedroom each, moved us to a good-sized house, but on the edge of a council estate. My dad is a council estate boy. My mum probably middle class growing up, but feeling, I think my parents felt very comfortable in this environment, which for me was just completely a different world. Looking out of my bedroom with a view of the city, just aware of like so many people and so much going on. And my parents put me in a local school, which was known locally as Druggy High. Oh, they didn't pick it because of its name. They picked it because it probably of all the schools locally, it had the most green fields, and they thought that maybe I'd feel most comfortable in an environment which had like the closest thing to a rural setting in a city. But the school was known for grass of a different kind, really. Its reputation was just absolutely shocking. And so to get to Druggy, I had to walk through this council estate, across a wasteland into another council estate where the school was based. And I learned very quickly that the wasteland between the two neighbourhoods wasn't a safe place to be. And I was told of fights between the rival neighborhoods, and that was the battleground. And I was told of various weapons of mass destruction that were used in kind of neighborhood wars, and therefore I was just deeply fearful. And you know, when you turn up halfway through a school year with your posh accent from rural Shropshire, with your uniform still very much intact, my tie had no bullet holes in yet, you know, all that kind of stuff. And I just remember standing out like a sore thumb, and people commenting on my on my posh accent and my posh clothes, and I just thought, flipping heck, I do not fit here. And I remember one particular time, well, it felt like going to school was even a task. Even getting to school was hard. I was deeply fearful in journeying to school. My sister, 2 years older than me, was a bit of a geek, so she'd stay for lessons that were after school and then after school clubs. And then my mum would send me to get her, and I was like, you're putting my life at risk to protect my older sister. And so that was a real task for me. One day I remember being chased across this field by a man, not a boy, but a man on a quad bike, sort of wielding this stick at me from one side of the field to the other. And when you've been chased a lot, I suppose you know all the best routes, the fastest way home, which garden can you run through, which is the fastest, safest way to get home. And I sort of made a pledge to myself, aged about 13, that I would do everything I possibly could to get a good education and a good job, and relocate to safety elsewhere, out of the city, back to a safe rural environment, back to the River Severn, where I'd probably buy a guard dog and a high fence, keep myself very much to myself. That was kind of my upbringing, really. So a real shell shock, two different environments. Yeah.
So at which stage did you come to personal faith then?
Well, it was like in my late teens, as I got to college, I sat next to a guy who'd been on a gap year to Canada and was absolutely rampant for Christ. Actually, I feel blessed in that God has always placed around me men that have invested in me. I remember my sister had this amazing boyfriend who just was sold out for Christ, and he was a great example to me through my teen years. But I really lived this dual life throughout my teens. And, there was a Sunday going Sam, and then there was the rest of my life. But at college, sat next to this sort of fiery young evangelist who'd had a year out in Canada. He was so mad about God and so affectionate whenever he saw me. He sort of latched onto me, I think, because I said I went to church, but he was so desperate for us to do stuff together. And whenever he would meet me in the corridors, he'd hug me. 6'4" guy hugging you in the school corridor probably isn't the best thing for your street cred, really. And he was like, please come to the Christian Union. This could be amazing. We could save the college for Christ. And I was like, this is so far from anything that I find appealing. And really, to make him go away, I promised I'd go one time. And actually, in that environment of the Christian Union, I encountered Christ, and he just turned my life upside down. But there was a moment where just a group of us sort of young Christian blokes used to meet in a conservatory of one of our parents, and we would just begin to dig into God's word and to call upon Christ to speak to us and to have his way with us. And there was this moment where the Holy Spirit dropped, and wow, things shifted in me. I think I went from that timid young lad, fearful of people, and God began to turn me outwards towards the broken and towards the hurting. And I felt all this stuff that God was beginning to say to me. There was this call of boldness upon my life. There was a desire to serve the poor where that had never been something. I've been this guy fearful of those people that I lived amongst. And I almost felt like God saying, from those you've run from, I will return you to. And man, I just began to think about all that I could do for Jesus. And so I was looking all the time at how I could begin to serve the poor. What would that look like? And I used to go into the city on a Friday night and make sandwiches and soup for street dwellers and street workers, and got my first real exposure to poverty on a grand scale. Really, the poorest, the poor in the city. and felt that God was maybe going to send me off around the world. For at one point, it was Estonia, and I was beginning to research into Tallinn. And then another time, it was India. Maybe India was where God would send me. But every time I thought about what missionary life would look like, what serving the poor would look like, I felt like the Lord say, if you can't cross the street, if you can't continue to serve the city, then you shouldn't look to cross a sea, or, you don't get on a plane. Look at those people that I've put in and around you. And that's where really this call to urban mission came. And it's at that point, I suppose, I began to hear about what the Message Trust were doing. Mm-hmm. They'd done this amazing school mission into the number one most deprived community in the country at the time. In the late 90s, that was a place called Openshaw in South Manchester, a council estate that had 110,000 people, a giant council estate, which was a slum clearance from inner city Manchester. And it almost created this giant ghetto of deprivation. And the Andy Hawthorne, through his work at the Worldwide Message Tribe, had gone into a school and seen 100 kids saved for Jesus. And when they'd attempted to put them in a local school, a local church, the church just didn't know what to do with them. And on the Sunday, 60 to 80 of these kids that had gotten saved at a gig had turned up at the church and really absolutely sort of trashed the place and driven around it with their bikes and brought in their dogs and all sorts of stuff. And so the church just didn't know what to do. Yeah. And so this rally call in the city to send young disciplers, young evangelists to relocate into that neighborhood was sort of sent out around the city and actually around the country. I remember Soul Survivor through the late 90s, 95 through 97, hundreds of people heard the call and decided they would relocate to the city. And I was one of those young people who, when they heard the call to move into the poorest parts of Manchester, were captivated. And that's my story, really. I heard the call and knew that this is what God was asking of me, to be a sort of bivocational missionary and to relocate from the suburbs into the city centre, into a deprived community. And it's that place in Openshaw, East Manchester, where I've now lived for the past 23 years.
Brilliant. So, I mean, one of my mantras is everything is relationship, and relationship doesn't happen overnight. You have to put in the hard yards of gaining credibility, of building up trust, don't you? So I love it that you've been there 23 years. You joined Eden 23 years ago, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So tell us what Eden looked like.
Honestly, Simon, it was just bonkers. My first visit, because I'd done the application form and then they invite you to come and have a good look round and have your interview. And I just remember saying, Lord, I think you might have got this one wrong. And hear him say, welcome home, Sam. This is your home. But the neighborhood, was very kind of typical Manchester neighborhood, in that it's back-to-back terraced houses, very narrow streets, no gardens, just a small yard at the back. You open out onto the street, thin walls, tiny 2 up, 2 down houses. And when we moved in, I mean, the neighborhood was ransacked, really. If you want to get a flavor of it, look on YouTube and look at The Forgotten People of Openshaw. There's a 5-part documentary that was played on Granada TV, as it was back in the day. So many boarded up houses, to the point where when we wanted to move in, we rang the local council, the housing association, and they said you can pick the house you want to move into. You can have any houses. So about 25 of us really pretty much lived on a couple of different streets. So there was loads of us filling these houses. And I moved in with a guy that I'd never met before. And we moved next to an Irish alcoholic on one side, and then a family of sex workers on the other. A mum and her mother and her daughter all working from home. And so it was just an eye-opener. Day one, I've moved in. My dad's helped me get all my stuff into the house. I'm in the tiny back bedroom of this 2-bedroom house. And as I'm settling down to sleep, there's this police helicopter that begins to circle, and then you hear the sound of like a car being joyridden up and down the kind of narrow terrace streets, and then it gets wedged in the alleyway between the wheelie bins, and I'm just thinking, this is bonkers. Like, what am I doing here? But absolutely assured that that is where Jesus would want to be. You know, I feel like I've been following Christ, and that Christ has led me to follow him into the place that now I dwell. Christ would dwell here. I'm absolutely assured of that. But we had some amazing times early on. It really was fantastic. When I look back, some of the stories, I mean, it didn't take long for my housemate to take advantage of the cheap houses. You know, you really couldn't buy a house for over 10 grand. They were super cheap. And so he bought a house, and I remember getting this phone call from him and saying, "Sam, you need to come home from work because we've been burgled." And getting home at the same time as a policeman arrived at our house. So I got there, and we went inside the house, and pretty much anything that could be taken had been taken. I think they left us with like the fridge, the cooker, and a sofa, but everything else had gone. And this policeman just saying, "Oh, lads, you have been done. Like, it's all gone." And I'm like, "What do you do when you've been done?" And he said, "Well, you know, you live on narrow streets, you live with neighbours in close proximity. Somebody will have seen something, so let's just chat to some of your neighbours." And so we went to our next door neighbour Paul and knocked on his door, and his door was open. And I thought, oh, I wonder if the burglars have burgled ours and then they've burgled Paul's. Maybe they've just worked their way up the street. And so we went inside Paul's house. He wasn't there, but all of our belongings were like piled up in the front room. And the policeman said, "Oh, you've been done by your neighbour." And I said, "Oh man, what are we supposed to do?" And he's like, "I really have not got a clue." And I said, "Maybe if you wait around, you know, you can catch him red-handed. Just wait around a while and you could get him when he comes back." And he was like, "That's not modern day policing. We don't really do that." And so he just helped me carry everything back, because that is modern day policing. And we got pretty much all of the stuff back. Good job he didn't wait around though, because it took a fair few weeks before Paul returned. We heard him rummaging around in his backyard. And, and so we sort of shouted over the wall, "Paul, are you there?" And he sort of sheepishly poked his head over the wall and said, "Oh, so I've heard you've had a hard time, guys." I said, "Oh, yeah, we've been burgled. Like everything was taken from our house." And he said, "I have no idea how that happened." And I said, "We've got a good idea, Paul." Anyway, he said, "Oh, did you get everything back?" And my housemate said, "Oh, well, everything apart from the antique Chinese chopsticks that had been on the fireplace." And like you do, like you have. And so Paul said, "Oh, hang on a minute." And he sort of ducked down, went back inside his house, and he found the Chinese chopsticks, and everything was returned to us. It was just extraordinary. And Paul was like, "How do I pay you back? You know, I've got to do something to say sorry." And we were like, "What can you offer us?" This is a guy who is a long-term heroin addict. He's penniless, has nothing. Like, we were like, why didn't you just come round for tea and we'll talk about stuff? He thought it was a trap and he was nervous about all that. And we just said, "Just come round, let's talk." And so he came round and we ate at the table, which he found utterly bizarre, like it was some kind of setup. And we just began to talk about what was going on in his life and what was happening and why he had to take from us. And all the time he kept saying, "How can I pay you back? How can I pay you back?" And and we were like, "Look, mate, it's all good. You're forgiven." We began to tell him about Jesus, and he said, "No, but I've got to do something. Maybe I could be your gardener," he said. Well, that's a lovely idea, but we haven't got a garden. We've got a yard, and he's got a yard, and he knows there is no garden. But what he meant by be our gardener was that at the front of the house, there was this like a meter of concrete with about a foot of mud in which weeds grew. And he wanted to be the gardener of our weeds and would take the rubbish that would collect, that the wind would blow into them, and he'd take off the dead leaves. And then one spring, this set of weeds blossomed, and it's actually a rose bush that I'd not even spotted, and this rose bush sort of blossoms. And it was this, for me, it was kind of this prophetic statement that amongst the mess and amongst the rubbish, actually something beautiful was beginning to grow, and the gospel really was beginning to take root, and something was just emerging from the mess, and that really was a beautiful thing for us. So we had some real adventures. I've had so many absolutely wild neighbours over the time. I had a guy called Otis that would just smoke marijuana 24/7. I couldn't really invite my gran round because she'd have probably got high going to the toilet up the stairs. It was so thick coming through the walls, and all sorts of wild stuff, wild neighbours, but lots of incredible salvation stories. Early on, lots and lots of people came to know Jesus. We built a baptistry out of wood in the Salvation Army church that we were planting, which was against all the regulations of the Salvation Army. Built a baptistry and began to baptize people because it felt like God was on the move. It was absolutely wonderful, those early days. Yeah.
Oh, mate. And you married a girl from Eden. Tell us about that.
Well, it's great. I lived at number 18. A girl that moved and joined the team, moved into number 6. We fell in love and got married and moved into number 13. And it felt almost equidistant between the two.
Yeah.
And we've tried to work out what it looks like to do mission together and to create a family. And we now got 2 kids by way of adoption, which is very special for us.
Tell us about the adoption journey. Was that always the plan or not?
I feel like it was for me. I feel like it's something I've had in my mind, that I'd be an adoptive dad. I don't think it was the plan for my wife, but actually, I wanted to be a dad young, and we were married. I was married by the time I was 21, and I expected to be a dad by 23. And then that's not the way it worked out. Actually, we battled infertility for over 10 years before the adoption journey then became a reality. And so I think God began to work in my heart years before infertility, probably because I would have been the hardest one to have work on. But really coming to terms with the infertility thing was deeply painful, but yet the hope of adoption was wonderful. And that journey is not easy at all. I remember after we'd gone through this lengthy process where they go into every detail of your life and you feel totally intruded upon while being desperate to be a dad. And then this social worker coming out with this file of a child that they had chosen for us, that we'd been matched with. And we read through this. She knew it was complicated. She kind of dumped it on our doorstep and ran because she knew that it wasn't going to be easy for us. And we read through it, and I was just grieved in my heart. I was like, "Oh Lord, this isn't the dream. This isn't what I thought we were going to have." And I'm ringing my dad and breaking my heart on the phone. The next day, sitting with my wife Nick and going through what we were going to do, and I just said, I think we should just tell the council that they've got it wrong. We need to go back to the drawing board. And Nick said, I think we should pray first, because she's a much godly woman, much more godly than me. And so she prayed downstairs and I prayed upstairs, and then she came running. I remember the sound of elation as she came running upstairs, and she said, do you remember the Bible verse that God gave us at the start of the adoption process? And I'm like, we have a Bible verse? And she's like, yeah, in her Bible, underlined and highlighted and dated. was this Bible passage from Isaiah 44. And it says, "Do not fear, for I'll pour out my spirit and blessing on your children, and they will thrive like a willow tree by a stream." And the girl that we'd been matched with was called Willow. The willow tree by a stream was the willow that we'd been matched with. And we were utterly convinced
Beautiful.
that God was going to enable this little life to thrive. We continue to live with that promise in the good days and in the bad days. We continue to hold to the promise that a willow will thrive. And that's a beautiful thing. And so we then went again to do the adoption thing a second time. And we were matched a couple of years later with a little boy called Alfie, and I was Googling to see if there was an Alfie in the Bible, and there is no Alfie. In fact, it means elf king, and there's definitely no elves in the Bible. And so we were like, "Wow, Lord, we didn't need another promise, because the promise over our kids is that they would thrive. So that includes Alfie. Let's go with that." And so the day we went to pick him up from his foster carer, we arrived, and there was our social worker, Alfie's social worker, and the foster carer that had brought him up. And the foster carer had registered his birth because he'd actually been relinquished. He'd been in care from day one.
Right.
And there was a feud going on. I wouldn't say a full-on fight, but there was a battle going on between these three ladies as to the birth certificate for Alfie, because his birth had been registered by his foster carer. And she'd called him Alfie. She'd named him Alfie. Then she left a space, no middle name, because she intended for the person who would one day adopt him to be able to name him. And then he had a surname too. But the birth certificate that we were to be handed had a middle name. And they were all trying to work out how it could possibly have gotten there. Nobody knew. And they were all disputing how it would be possible for there to be this middle name. The middle name that he had was Nathan. Alfie Nathan is his name. And that name, Nathan, means gift of God. And we knew, his birth had been registered by a completely non-believing foster carer, but that God miraculously had placed a middle name in there for us, just to know that he had it all in control. And so it's been a precious journey, one which is full of delight and absolute carnage all at the same time. But we together now try to work out, how do we be a family on mission? What does it look like to remain faithful to the call that God has placed upon our lives? How do we serve together and serve Christ and the people that he's placed us amongst?
That's so good.
Hi, folks. I hope 2024 has got off to a good start. I think most of you know this podcast comes out on the auspices of Great Lakes Outreach, working in Burundi, which is still annoyingly the hungriest and poorest country in the world. And there are so many positives. I mean, I look back at the last year, see that we've impacted a couple of 100,000 people in a very meaningful way. I've got all these lovely photos of prostitutes that we've helped get out of prostitution, giving them a new skill as tailors. I think of street kids that we've helped get off the streets. Think of microfinance loans that we've given out to poorest of the poor people, mainly widows who have managed to start up businesses and are now thriving, being lifted out of poverty. Mud huts that we've been able to knock down and build sort of brick houses with a tin roof and a door that can be locked to actually protect these vulnerable ladies. So many people have come into relationship with Jesus, come to faith. I mean, it's absolutely beautiful. In that context, at the same time, there have been 40% food price rises of basic foodstuffs, and there have been 5 hikes in the last 3 months of fuel, which just adds up to crippling inflation that affects everybody. It's so challenging. So if you want to back us, if you're enjoying the podcast, I'd really appreciate it, you sowing into the work. And that's so you can go do that at greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. We'd love it for you to journey with us. greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. And keep enjoying the podcast. Now let's get back to it.
So you were bivocational for a while. I mean, that's probably chronologically going back a bit. What did that look like?
Well, I was an accountant for a fair few years. I mean, people people look at me and think you probably don't fit the bill. I think I probably was the worst accountant going. But in a sense, it provided me with an opportunity to do a 9 to 5 and then just get straight back onto the mission field. And I absolutely loved that. It was a job which really I could box off quite easily and then just get out and on the mission. And so as soon as I'd get home, pretty much every night of the week, there was something to do to serve the neighborhood. And we looked, creatively at whatever we could do. We looked at the needs of the neighborhood. We looked at our skill set, and God does this amazing thing where I think he aligns those, what are you gifted in and what does the neighborhood need? And then God beautifully sort of knits them together. So I did loads of detached youth work, youth clubs, football clubs. On a Saturday, I used to take some lads that all had no father figures, and I just did this club called Saturday Club, because that's how creative I am with naming things. And I just do stuff with them that I felt dads should do. I'd take them for walks in the Peak District, or we'd go to the beach for a day. We'd sit in McDonald's and we'd play games and we'd dream dreams about their future and stuff. And it's an honor, 20 years later, to still know those young men. Well, in fact, they're not that young these days. Yeah. And to have had the opportunity to invest in them. So yeah, the bivocational thing was really just the way in which I could fund being a missionary. And I'm sure that's, something that other people can think about.
I mean, you talk about leaving work to go to the mission, but presumably even as an accountant, you're on mission there.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, people found me an absolute enigma because I was just such an odd guy. I remember some of my sort of colleagues talking about how much they spent on wine and what they did at the weekends. And, my life to them was utterly bizarre. When I talked about my best friend being a sort of a toothless heroin addict, they were like, what on earth are you about? And I talk about Saturday Club. Oh, I'm going to take these lads. I think this weekend we'll go to the zoo, and they'd be like, I don't understand you, Sam. So I'd get regularly lots of questions, but really they were utterly intrigued by the bizarre nature of my life and how countercultural it was, so utterly upside down to the way that they were living. But I suppose it was a great opportunity to talk to them about what it was to live for Jesus and the values of King Jesus and the upside down nature of his kingdom. And I suppose you never really leave mission, do you?
No. So you were part of one Eden team initially, although there were dozens that spread out across Manchester and across the nation, and I guess even overseas. But you then were invited to lead Eden nationally. What did that look like?
Yeah, I began to take on the team that we'd been a part of after about 7 years, and we'd planted a church, so I became the church leader there of a Salvation Army church. In fact, I think at the time I was the only non-Salvationist, non-officer to lead a Salvation Army church, which in itself was quite controversial, particularly then when you like to do communion and baptism, which is a bit of a no-no within that denomination. And so I led that church for about 7-8 years before I was invited to begin to develop Eden outside of Manchester. Like you say, it had been focused on Manchester for its first decade. And then opportunities to sort of develop that outside of Manchester came. I looked after some of the work in Yorkshire, and then London was beginning to develop. So as the Eden Network developed, I was then invited to take on the national role as the national director and begin to see that initiative grow and to flourish. And we've planted now over 70 teams around the UK. And like you say, there's now some in South Africa, in Canada, and Germany. So all sorts of teams across the nations now.
Beautiful. I'm sure it hasn't been straightforward. Go on, share. We love being authentic and nitty gritty. Biggest challenges you faced over the years?
Oh, I tell you what, I'd have a list of things that have gone wrong and that I found difficult. You know what? I think if I was to really be straight with you, I think the loss of those you've invested in over the years is the hardest thing. I became aware of that parable of the sower and the
Mm.
different soils, and we saw lots of fruit grow up quickly and then die away, and that has been difficult. Or those who relationally you've poured yourself into, and then they fall in love with a non-Christian fella, and then they seem to sack off the Christian faith in a moment,
Mm.
or something goes wrong in the community and they get hurt and they disappear. I think we have really counted the cost of that, as well as those people for whom you've seen Jesus do some wonderful things in, and then tragedy strikes. I think about a guy called Lee. Lee was in and out of my house. He's actually the first man that I met when we moved into the neighborhood. He was the same age as me, but had been already battling addiction from a very, very broken home. And we got to know Lee. I remember the first time he came to our house, he refused to come in. We had a barbecue. So he sat on the wall at the back, and I sort of handed him food on top of this 8-foot wall, just like passing him food up because he refused to come into the house. But we got to know Lee and learned of his struggles and his addictions, and the kind of upbringing that he'd had, which was in abject poverty. And Lee, we journeyed through rehabilitation at times. One of my favorite stories is I took him down to Teen Challenge, managed to find him a bed. I'd actually put him in my house because the way you could get in there was almost you had to wait for a bed to get free. And the only way I could get stability for this guy was to put him up in the back bedroom, which hadn't asked permission for. My wife Nick came over from work to find the house full of smoke, and and Lee in the back bedroom, which was something I had to resolve. Anyway, we sent him off to Teen Challenge, drove down to South Wales, and when you drop someone at Teen Challenge, it's amazing, right? They took Lee on a tour of the house, but they said, "Oh, we'll come and make you a cup of tea in the kitchen," but they had no intention of making me tea. They wanted to exit me out the back door, and they say, "Look, we don't do big goodbyes. You just get in your car and drive. You'll hear from Lee in about 6 months. Just get going." And I was like, "This is amazing. He's going to come back fixed. Everything's sorted. He'll fall in love with Jesus. It's all sorted." And got in my car, drove home. That was a Friday. On a Sunday morning, I was opening up for church and found Lee on the front doorstep. And he had the audacity to tell me that I was late. And I said, "Well, you're 6 months early. Like, what are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, you didn't say goodbye." And I said, "I wasn't allowed to say goodbye." And he said, I just wanted to pop outside for a cig. They wouldn't let me have a cig. So I hitched a lift home. And then he'd gotten on a train without a ticket. And I said, "What time did you get home?" And he'd technically beaten me home. He'd gotten on this train that had actually got him home faster than me. So yeah, that was a funny one. But Lee, we journeyed through ups and downs. At times he was homeless, would sleep in like a shed on an allotment, or in the summer sometimes he'd sleep in a bunker in a local golf course, or I even found him he'd sleep in my porchway when I was away on holiday and stuff, because it was where he felt safe. And then after lots of prayer, he would love to pray, love to do Bible studies. I really felt like he had a saving faith. Addiction began to be something he put in the past. He got clean through rehabilitation, was actually given a home of his own by the council. And then I was called by his ex-girlfriend to tell me that he'd been murdered by his neighbour. They'd gotten into an altercation and he'd stamped on his neck and taken his life. And that loss is the kind of loss that I've really, really struggled with.
Yeah.
Where you feel like the amount of investment and then life is taken away. But it hasn't that he's fallen from faith. It's that his life has been taken. Deeply painful.
Yeah. Yeah. What verses are sort of what do you hold dearest to in terms of the promises of God, or what's your theology of working with the poor? How's that shaped?
Interesting. Yeah, I'd say, I mean, we as a team used to hold fast to Isaiah 62 and some of those promises over there. Over the city of Israel, we would talk about being over our neighborhood, and there's one about no longer being deserted. You'll be a place that people will want to come to, and actually it's interesting. I remember at one point seeing a billboard that the police had put up in our neighborhood saying that crime had reduced in this area by 80%, and thinking, actually, this was your promise over us, God.
Yes.
And then there was the annual most desirable place to live in the Guardian, I think it was. And number one was somewhere like Cheltenham, and then number two, Openshaw, East Manchester.
You're joking.
And we were like, what on earth? And this was what it said in Isaiah 62. This place was going to be desirable. And because it had been worked out on some kind of algorithm, the price, the house prices compared with its proximity to a thriving city or whatever, meant that it was now considered up and coming, and there was investment from the council coming through regeneration. But we knew, we knew it was the fulfillment of God's promises to us, and that for us has always been this kind of, when God gives us a promise and we hold to it and continue to try and serve Him in ways, you'll see stuff that you never thought you'd ever see. You'll see the promises of God fulfilled. And that's what you have to hold on to, when it gets difficult and when it gets hard.
Yeah, I mean, our chronologies are similar in terms of, you've been there 23 years. My Burundi journey has been 25 years, 20 years in country. And
Wow.
and you look at things objectively, like Burundi is still the hungriest and poorest country in the world by IMF statistics. You're still in a place where there's loads of deprivation. But we know, don't we, of so many individual lives that have been radically transformed, and we know of whole shifts in terms of atmosphere, and God sees the one, He works through the one, and that creates the critical mass to see real change, doesn't it?
That's right. Yes, absolutely. And I have to hold on to that, where I've seen God work in the lives of the one. And actually, sometimes I was reflecting on it earlier. The one that I've invested in most is actually a man called Steve, who is probably my closest friend in the world, and actually seeing God work in his life and through his addictions, now clean of drugs for almost 2 years, and pushing into his Bible, sends me Bible verses, and I'm so grateful to God for what He's done in that man's life. But you hold on to the one.
Yeah, I love that. So what does keep you going in general?
I think the key thing for me is closeness to Christ. Proximity to Jesus, seeing His downward mobility, seeing that He is the poor. I think that's been game changing from Matthew 25, that Christ identifies with the hungry, the homeless, the unclothed, and the prisoner. The fact that Christ's face is found in those keeps me going. I was just thinking, even yesterday, I had the privilege of going out with a neighbour to get him some food. Knocked on the door, needing some food because he'd run out. Just a privilege, sat with him in the car, feeling like Christ say, can you see my face? Can you see me in the life of this poor man? Yes, I can, Lord. And that keeps me going. I think about that passage, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And I find that very difficult, but it's actually impossible to do. If you love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, you'd have nothing left to do that second part of the commandment, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. But I think there's this beautiful thing when we align ourselves with Christ, when we do our best to love Him, that actually as we love Him with all of ourselves, He begins to pour into us a love for neighbor. And I think that's been the key thing that's kept me going. I've realized that in my own strength, I can't sustain urban mission.
Yeah.
I can't sustain a heart for the poor. But actually, when I love Christ, when I stay close to Him, when I pursue Him and His kingdom, when I seek Him first, when I press into loving Him with all of my heart, mind, soul, and strength, I feel like it's Him that pours love into me. We talk about compassion, meaning to suffer with. And often we talk about suffering with our neighbors, suffering with those that we've put that we've been put amongst. But actually, our call is first to suffer with Christ, to share in his sufferings. And when we begin to delight in his sufferings, when we share in the sufferings of Christ, I think he pours into us the compassion that we need and the strength that we need, the love that we need to continue to pour our lives into those around us. And that's the thing that sustains me on the mission, for sure.
Mm. Sometimes I just want to sit in it because that's so meaty what you just said. Now I want to ask you about what sacrifice looks like, but you bleed Openshaw, I bleed Burundi. It's 2+ decades of our lives. We're committed for the long haul. Sometimes people say to me, oh, it's been such a sacrifice, and your selfless life. And it makes me think of one of my heroes, David Livingstone, who once wrote in his journal, he said, people talk of the sacrifice I have made in spending so much of my life in Africa. Can that be called a sacrifice? Which is simply paying back a small part of the great debt owing to our God, which we can never repay. Is that a sacrifice which brings its own blessed reward in healthful activity, the consciousness of doing good, peace of mind, and a bright hope of glorious destiny hereafter? Away with the word in such a view and with such a thought. It is emphatically no sacrifice. Say rather, it is a privilege. And I know, bro, that you would say, it is a privilege. It's such a privilege, isn't it? But at the same time, so we take that, it is a privilege, but there is definitely sacrifice and suffering in there. Can you speak into that?
That is incredible. I love that quote, actually. It's absolutely profound, and one that suddenly gives you a fresh perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think sacrifice is something that we're all called to consider. But I think if you were to talk to any of the Eden workers around the globe, they would probably say the same thing, which is they've received far more than they have given. They've gained greater joy and peace, and have benefited so deeply from the love that they've received from neighbours. You're absolutely right. The joy that is found in serving Christ is far outweighs any of the sacrifices. But I do think we are called to sacrificial living. And I think we have to ask what that looks like. And I think that changes over time. I moved in as a single man. The sacrifice that was required of me then is different than that of a married man. And I think the sacrifice that I made when I first moved in isn't a sacrifice once and for all time. It's something that we have to continue to monitor and evaluate, and the sacrifice changes. So I move in as a single man, and then I marry, and we have to ask ourselves as a couple, what does it look like to live sacrificially for Christ together as a couple? What does that look like? And I think we've again addressed that as we take on children. Lord, do you still want us to remain in this neighborhood, bringing up these adopted kids? Do you want us to stay? And if you do, what does that look like to live sacrificially here? And I think regularly returning to sacrifice, almost like to a picture, the people of God heading to Jerusalem on pilgrimage, making their sacrifice. They almost do it annually, and it's means tested. So the sacrifice that you make in moving to Burundi is actually it's different for me, but it should be of almost equal value in a way. We have to ask the Lord, what do you require of me? Some people will say, I just don't think I could move into a deprived community. I say, maybe you couldn't, but ask the Lord what it is to live sacrificially for him. Because I think we're all called to sacrifice. So I think we regularly come across it, when my kids need to enter the school system, am I gonna, because they're adopted, I suppose they qualify to go into any school because they would get priority schooling, which is a beautiful thing. Or am I going to put them in a local school, which at the time was failing Ofsted? And so what's the sacrifice God is asking of us? And we felt the Lord speak to us as we began to make that decision before him. Feel like him say, if it's not good enough, if the school isn't good enough for your children, it's not good enough for any children in this neighborhood. So why don't you do something to make that school good? Put your kids in.
I love that.
Make poverty personal, make injustice personal, and then you'll do something about it. That's how we fix things. We make it impact us so that we, therefore we fill the the governing body with a whole bunch of Christians. We make sure there's a new focus on education. We tidy up the neighborhood. We pump it full of resource wherever we can. When we make poverty personal, we bring change. And so that's what we felt. But I think you have to ask regularly, Lord, if you want us here, help us to do it. What does it look like? Show us how to be missional. And that changes. And something I've struggled with, I suppose I had so much time capacity to pour into my community. And I live now with a national role, traveling all over the place. And actually, I'm finding it really hard because I just want to be in the neighborhood. I find it so difficult that I haven't got the same time I did to invest. And that feels sacrificial at the moment. Yeah. As I try and develop ministry nationally, it's coming at the expense of local mission. And I find that really tough at times.
Yeah. Oh, mate, I love that. The idea, that's just turning on its head the issue of like, how can we up this school that is so down and be a part of that transformation rather than opting out and going to the fanciest school? That is superb. Listen, I think of a verse that comes to mind, Luke 9:23. If Jesus said, if anyone would come after me, he or she must deny self, take up cross daily and follow me. And you have chosen very distinctively the path of downward mobility, going in terms of going to a tougher area. Most people's trajectory is upward mobility. Most Christians in this country and overseas in general, because when you start following Christ, you become more productive, you become a better contributing member of society. Therefore, there's upward mobility. Therefore, people would tend to move out of Openshaw into whatever fancier suburb in Manchester. Most listeners here, I'm guessing, would be living in suburbia. I'm living in suburbia right now. So that challenge, without ladling on the guilt, which is the last thing we need, what is that challenge you put out there to people that the danger is we're settling for a comfortable Christianity, isn't it?
I do really get concerned about that. I feel like the church in our nation is often forsaking the poor. I'm involved in all sorts of different charities, mainly around deprivation and its impact, whether that's on health or education. And I've recognized that health favors the wealthy. The wealthier you are statistically, the healthier you'll be. You've got you're more likely to take your medication on time. You rest well, eat well. And so you get this spiral upwards in health when you're wealthy. Same in education. Education favors the wealthy. You're more likely to have access to the internet. You're if you're wealthy, you're more likely to have a worldview, holidays, investment of stable family home, eat well, rest well. That stuff that means that you just perform better, and so that upward mobility when it comes to education. Sadly, it grieves me that I feel like the church favors the wealthy too, and that is of great concern. Why do I say that? Well, if you look at the Church of England statistics, they spend on average £8 per head per congregant nationally, £24 if you're in a rural area, and £4 if you are in a deprived community. Church in deprived communities is declining at the fastest rate. The resource churches of our nation are found in the wealthiest parts of our city. Church planters who come to Manchester want to often focus in the sort of thriving urban centre, down through the student zone, or in the wealthy southern band. Who's church planting in the north and the east? Actually, it really grieves my heart that the Church of Christ who considers himself poor, identifies with the least and the last, his church, his people, called by his name, are finding themselves increasingly upwardly mobile. It grieves my heart. But I'm a strong believer in something called the prosperity gospel. Not the prosperity gospel of American evangelicalism, not in any way. I believe that the gospel does prosper us, and it prospers us in joy and peace, and it prospers us with all the fruits of the Spirit. It prospers us when we pursue the things of the King. So it's not like we forsake all those things when we move into deprived communities. It's not like suddenly our lives are ruined. Actually, there is greater prosperity when we pursue the things of the kingdom. Seek first the kingdom of God and its righteousness, and all these things will be added. There is care. There is provision for those who will choose to be downwardly mobile and seek first the kingdom of Christ. We don't need to worry. It's not that we lose all. In fact, we gain so much, if not more, when we choose this way of living.
Amen. And God meets all your needs according to his glorious riches in Christ. He never leaves you. He never forsakes you. The one who calls you is faithful, and he will do it. There are so many promises to hold on to, aren't there? Listen, we've run out of time, but is there anything else you wanted to say? I don't want to miss out on any more gold. It's been fantastic.
No, it's brilliant just to talk to you, Simon. Thank you so much for the time to share my story.
Brilliant. And anything to plug?
We don't need to fill our time with that necessarily. Plug Jesus, move in, serve the poor.
Love it. All right, well, I'll put message details in the blurb, Eden stuff, and mate, it's been so good to talk to you. Keep firing, you, Nick, the kids, the community. I know your role's a whole lot bigger in terms of national stuff and all your travels. As you said, keep close to Jesus all the way, and we're cheering you on. Thanks, Sam.
Cheers, mate. Thank you.
Brilliant. Folks, I've loved that, and I feel definitely stirred and encouraged deep in my spirit. Listen, if you have, then please share it with some of your mates. Get other people to subscribe. Give us a great review on Spotify, iTunes. That helps more people come across the podcast. I want to thank Adam Thomas Steer for the editing and Mike Sandeman for the mixing. And next week, we'll have another fantastic guest. In the meantime, go well and God bless. Toodaloo.